All right.
I should say, by the way, just before we get started, this just an amusing anecdote. After our mishap, for those who missed it, we tried to do this 2 days ago, and I don't know, something wasn't working. And so I went out to get some new equipment. I thought, if we're hunkered down for the foreseeable future, we know we're going to be communicating with our constituents, with our Impact Nations family more and more in this way, just through Facebook Live and things like that. I thought we need to up our game. So I thought, let's go get ourselves a really fancy webcam so that my shaved head is looking really good in HD.
You were really thinking, as always, you were ahead of the curve.
Yeah, really. We're trying to flatten that curve, okay? So I went to Best Buy. I wasn't even sure they were still open, and I said, "Hey, can you show me where your webcams are?" And she just started to laugh at me, and she said, "Well, this is where the webcams were." She says, "But with everybody working from home, they've all bought them all up, so there's nothing left." So I'm not in 4K yet, but next week we hope to come to you in 4K, and we'll look really sharp. So,
which won't matter because you have terrible upload speed anyway. I'm just saying.
Yes, that's a good point. Thank you for that. You really got that gift of encouragement down, Brad. That's good.
I know. I'm a cynic.
All right, well, let me officially get this thing started. Welcome to the Impact Nations podcast. My name is Tim. I am your host. Today I am joined by Steve. I call him Dad. You can call him Steve. And our very good friend of the podcast, Brad Jerzak. Brad, welcome. We're so glad to have you back.
Thank you. I appreciate your hospitality.
Indeed, from a distance. And so today we are starting what will be kind of a three-part discussion on the work of the cross. For those who follow along with Impact Nation's Tuesday night teaching that Dad does, he's been doing the mystery of the cross. Or if you listen to our audio podcast, then you would have heard this just last week. We have been in the Mystery of Christ series, and we just last week with episode 11 started what will be a three-part teaching on the mystery of the cross. And since Dad's travel plans got canceled, Brad's travel plans got canceled, we thought, well, heck, we've got some time. Why don't we dig deep and really explore the work of the cross together? And as Dad and I talked about that, we thought, who better to do that with than with Brad Jerzak? So we're really excited. And so this week, in our first of three discussions, I want to really investigate the experience of the cross. What was Jesus experiencing on the cross, and how can we kind of enter into that? If you listen to episode 11, and if you haven't, I encourage you to do that. Just impactnations.com/podcast. You can subscribe or listen there. But Dad was really looking at the experience of the cross. And so we want to limit our discussion there. We've got a lot of theological work to go through that we're going to do in the next two discussions likely. But this week we're trying to limit our discussion specifically to what Jesus was experiencing and how we can enter into that on the cross. So Brad, I'm interested to know how you emotionally engage, you personally, how you emotionally engage with the work of the cross.
So as we shared offline last time, I want to tell you how that shifted for me. So my backstory of that is that sometime in the 90s, I was really in a time of worship and prayer with a guy I was mentoring, and he wanted to sort of enter into the experience of the cross in terms of the agony of Christ, and so he was praying fervently about this and really thanking God and all, and that totally legit, right? But in the midst of this, I heard in my spirit very clearly, I don't want your pity, I want your life. And so I think I've been through, I've seen a lot of sermons where they would go into the agonies of Christ in great explicit detail. And I'm not so sure why we're doing that now. If it has to do with leading us to gratitude for what he suffered in order to rescue us from, the the human condition, so to speak. That's fair enough, right? But the engaging the cross emotionally is not meant to be a pity party for Jesus. What it's meant to be is a moment of surrender. And and so now let's fast forward to my current experience and thoughts on that. So what was Christ experiencing on the cross? It seems to me that even beginning in the Garden of Gethsemane, he he enters into a new depth of union with fallen humanity by bearing all our sins and all our sorrows. When he's in Gethsemane and he's sweating drops of blood, it's not because he can't face his own torture and death courageously. Many martyrs have done so with, singing hymns. What he's enduring there already in Gethsemane is the weight of the world now, as he unites himself to every man, woman, and child on the planet for all history, which could even be, we may be talking 60,000 years of human history, you know, so, or more. But, and what's going on there? He is entering into that union so that he can bring about a great exchange. So we have Paul in the language of exchange, in that union. He takes the ashes of our grief, and then in that union we receive, what was it, beauty for ashes, Isaiah 61, right?
Yep.
Garment of praise for a spirit of heaviness, or Paul's language, it's his riches for our poverty. And so it's like he comes heart to heart on the cross with all of humanity. And it's no longer 2,000 years ago. We're not just remembering something he did 2,000 years ago. He rearranges space-time history such that all of history now revolves around the cross. So when I come to the cross, I am not time traveling 2,000 years ago, or I'm not watching it from a distance, but now I'm actually with the crucified and risen one. And that's one other thing I want to mention about it. When Paul talks about the cross, he doesn't just mean the crucifixion. He doesn't just mean Good Friday. For Paul, when he says, I glory in nothing but the cross, he's talking about Christ's death, his conquest of Hades, and his glorious resurrection. The whole weekend then for him is encapsulated. So when he says, I resolve to preach nothing but Christ and him crucified, in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, it's like, well, wait a minute, what about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15? It's like, no, it's all one thing to Paul. And so for us, it's a union of him in death and in resurrection from death. And then that becomes part of my now experience. And I have lots of stories about that we can get into, but I should check in with you now because I've been talking for 5 minutes.
Well, I'm interested to know if Dad made a statement during his teaching that the church, perhaps the Western church, you can clarify, it tends to think that they've already understood the cross and move very quickly beyond it, and not spend time contemplating. Maybe you can clarify some of your statement on that. But the church, the statement you made was the church believes that they've already understood the cross and they move on.
Yeah, I think that's true. Certainly, in the I'm most familiar experientially with the evangelical tradition, and I think that we do move on quickly, and we get the victory of the resurrection, which is true. But we don't talk a lot about the suffering of the cross. Some of the listeners may have noted that I think just the week before is when we put up the Gethsemane, and I fully agree with you. It was the weight of everything, and the powers that be, the principalities and powers. It was really, it begins there, doesn't it? And takes us right through Sunday. And I think that the other thing is we tend to, and I know that I did, kind of almost a sanitized view of the cross. The horror of the cross wasn't that horrible for me, really. until we start to think of what literally happened, and I referred to that early on in the podcast.
So my question is, how do we bridge those two gaps? Because what I'm actually hearing is a bit of tension between what you've just said, Brad. You started by saying, hey, we're not to pity him, and yet you're saying, yeah, but slow down, don't move right to the resurrection. Let's spend some time contemplating the experience of the cross,
understanding the penalty that was paid. I mean, the price that was paid, rather, is what I meant. The price that was paid at the cross is huge, and I personally have found that it's becoming helpful for me to contemplate that. Not as you said, Brad. Not kind of a Mel Gibson approach, if I can say that, but to recognize this wasn't just a theological event. This wasn't just, well, this is a transaction that had to take place, but the incredible weight, unparalleled, that was on Christ.
Yeah, the way I have a few responses to that. One would be, it is helpful for us to move, as you just did in front of us, to move from the idea of penalty, which has to do with, which we associated with how badly did God punish his son.
Yeah.
I just would reject that. But
me too.
You moved into, I think a helpful word for what you're describing is, what did it cost? And why do we ponder what it cost? One of the reasons that we do that I think it's appropriate to ponder that cost is because when we start talking about radical grace and radical forgiveness, and that his blood can cleanse anything and anyone, one of the objections that comes up is, oh, that's too easy. And we respond to that objection with the cost. It's like, I want you to go stand before Christ and consider what he endured, and in that moment tell him, oh, this was too easy. And so I did this once with a guy who had molested children as a babysitter and got away with it because he was a minor himself. So although he was fully caught, there was no penalty for him, and yet he was enduring terrible agony, and as his conscience was accusing him, and how he was medicating that with a sex addiction. Okay, so he came to me to confess all of this. So under the law, he's off the hook, but under his conscience is an infallible judge who was not letting him off the hook and actually tormenting him. So we did exactly this thing, and I took him to the cross, and I was angry at him. I'm like, just tell him what you did, and and then I asked the Lord, and how do you respond? And Jesus spoke to him from the cross. See, and it's a now moment, and he said, I forgive you. And the man said, no, that's too easy. And then Christ looks at him from the cross, bearing the weight of his abuse, and says, no, it wasn't, like really sternly. And it's like, so when people say we're like that, if you teach grace or inclusion, you're soft on sin, where it's like quite the opposite, actually, that the weight of the world that Christ bore gives him the right to include anyone and everyone he wants in that suffering, right? So I see a value at that level. And Paul will pull that language out. It's like, look, you are bought with a price, so glorify God in your bodies. I would also add this, that really Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what we call the synoptic gospels, they focus on the agony and the murder of Jesus Christ, that the cross was this great tragic conspiracy that focuses on the lamb slain, right? But in John's gospel, the glory doesn't wait for the resurrection. There is a glorification of Christ as he ascends his throne, which is a cross. So now the hour has come that the Father glorifies the Son. Which hour? The hour of his death, so that the cross becomes also a great victory. And again, that will play out through the resurrection, but already John is envisioning the cross of Christ as the judgment seat, and we all stand before that judgment seat as one of the two thieves. And which orientation will you have towards divine love when it's refracted through human sin in such a way? And then also that now he says that the prince of this world is driven out. So there's a real focus in John on, like, oh yes, we get the victimization of Christ, but we also see it from heaven's point of view now, that this is the grand victory where through death he destroys death.
You, when we were chatting the other day offline, um, you made a very interesting point. I pondered, a favorite verse for many of us in 2 Corinthians 3 is we behold, we're being transformed, we're being changed. And I think you said the word literally is transfigured,
Yeah.
as we behold his glory.
Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit about that in terms of the cross, beholding his glory?
Right. So some of my theological reflections come from human human stories where I've been a witness. And so here would be an example. Um, because the cross is this place of glorious exchange, we can come there in prayer with our burdens, and we can exchange those burdens for his gifts. And I have found personally that in praying with people, the best place to do that is at the cross. But often I'll have them picture the risen Christ in front of the cross, so that it's clear we're talking to someone who's not still tacked up there. He's able to hold out his hands to receive us, and uh, to remind us that at the cross he bore these burdens, and so he's willing to bear them now, and that he's willing to open also his hands with gifts to us. And that's where I make an emotional connection with the cross. It's less about, well, poor Jesus, but more and more about, how does coming into that space right now, and as an experience, affect me. So I had shared with you guys about a woman that 15 months ago, she had done this exercise as part of a church service I was leading in New Zealand, and she had come before the cross. She had exchanged her sorrows for his gifts and had a profound healing moment. And then in that moment, she also became a bit upset because she's like 36 years old and she's wondering, why have I never experienced the cross before? Why has it always been just a theology of the cross, or a memory of the cross? Why hasn't it been a living place in my heart to this moment? It's like, I don't know, but you know, you've experienced it now, so that's good. And so then after the service, uh, just still, dramatically changed as she was transfigured as she beheld his glory. But she didn't know the half of it because she went to tell her ex-Christian friend later that day about her experience. And this ex-Christian friend, although she's walked away from Christ, she also still, they have a good relationship, so they can share openly about what's happening in their lives. And as she's telling her friend about this experience, she begins to glow with light. She's transfigured in front of her ex-Christian friend, and it's so bright that her friend has to turn her face away. It's like, she has to avert her eyes from the brightness.
Wow.
Imagine a welder's torch,
Oh,
and this light is emanating from this woman as she's just talking about what she beheld and what she experienced on the cross. And I thought, this is amazing. It's also a kind of a profound and sad example of the great sin of the Old Testament, which is forgetting. Because a year later, when she brought it up with her friend could hardly remember that it happened. And like, how is this possible? You were an eyewitness of the most amazing thing in the world, and she's like, oh yeah, I think something like that happened. Oh yeah, maybe. And it was like this dim memory.
Yeah.
And I think that's the power of when Steve talks about when the when our eyes are blinded by the god of this age. It obscures even the most profound miracles before our eyes. But the good news is that, so what's going on there, where she's metamorphosis is really what's occurring. We're being changed from glory to glory into the image of Christ. How? By gazing on his glory. What glory? The glory revealed on the cross. And you could say, well, probably any gospel story that you're beholding Christ in, you're seeing the love of God, and that will change you. But it comes to this apex on Good Friday.
Thanks for sharing that. It's a remarkable story.
Incredible. I'm interested to talk a little bit about gospel proclamation in light of these things. And I think this is a good place to kind of segue from that. When you were teaching, Dad, a few weeks back, you got into 1 Corinthians chapter 1. You quoted verse 18 and 23. Verse 18 says, the cross is foolishness to those who don't believe. And then a few verses later in the next paragraph, he says, and I'm going to proclaim the cross. So my question to both of you is, how do we proclaim the cross to those who believe it's foolishness? What does that look like? What's that sound like?
Wow.
You want to go first, Steve?
No, I was just going to say, I just like to bounce off whatever.
I really like being the guy who gets to ask the questions. It's a good place to be.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I think what Paul's talking about in context there is both to the Jews and the Greeks.
Yeah.
They are looking for something more glorious than a cross. Their ideas of God have to do with triumphalism, and they don't know the half of triumph if they don't see that the triumph of love occurred on a cross. But it's I think both the Jews and the Greeks had expectations of something less messy, less earthy, less fleshy, and that doesn't involve death and resurrection. They can't even get to resurrection at that point. It's just like, no, this makes no sense. The God we're used to is either Almighty Zeus or Almighty Yahweh, and they had not foreseen that the means of the victory would be this glorious death. It makes no sense. So today, I think maybe people get it a little bit more because we have now this long backstory of that the crucifixion story has permeated our culture, and you can see it even in the great stories and novels and movies of our time, and where that message has now begun to take hold. However, I would say one group that has a lot of trouble understanding this might be Christians. That it's become foolishness to Christians who still just want the triumph without understanding that there's a death involved here.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. That even it seems like almost the message in the current Christian church is how do we mitigate, or even how do we avoid suffering, because we're called to live victorious lives, not recognizing that the suffering is very much the means of victory, and so it is so central. It is so central. I've just begun a series last night on the Beatitudes, and as I've been studying it, I'm seeing that the Beatitudes are really a biography of Jesus.
Yeah.
The poor in spirit, mourning, etc. And so I think that's part of what I was trying to say a few minutes ago, that we pass too quickly from the cross. I guess what I really mean is we pass too quickly from embracing the true, not only the work of God, but the character of God at the cross.
Yep.
Brad, you've been a big influence in this area for me. The whole term kenotic love comes out of my mouth a lot when I preach now. And And every now and then I'll even reference you, but usually they go, wow, that's incredible revelation. Where does he get this? But the issue that the cross is not the low point, but the high point of the glory of God. Anyway, I'll let you develop that more.
Well, you've raised something that my friend Lori Martin has pointed out to me, and she says a lot of people think they're living in the glory of the resurrection, but in fact they're still stuck at the triumphal entry. Yeah. They're waving palm branches, because they've not known what it is to co-suffer. And so I wonder if part of the problem has been our language of substitution. He suffered so you don't have to. That's not true.
No.
He suffered to enter our suffering with us, to raise us up and then that happens. Those who follow the Jesus way are called to pick up that same cross. Mm-hmm. That we co-suffer with those who suffer in order to raise them up. But you don't do that with palm branches. You do it with a cross. And so even in terms of the radical empathy of the cross, where God steps into our shoes, I think Impact Nations has been a good example of where you step into the shoes of those whose suffering you witness, and there's an agony to that, and then but also you walk with them, and there's an exchange, a divine exchange of their grief for the love of God that you have to share with them. But you guys, I know, because of what you witness and what you experience with those who suffer in the world, that you've had your own Gethsemane, so it's not just raw all the time. No. Although if what I like about what Impact Nations is doing is that your testimonies really are like, wow, we've met the living Savior. It's not like we're just going to have a pep rally for this coming King who will help us avoid all these problems. So do you resonate with the triumphal entry version versus the true triumph of the cross and resurrection?
Yeah, that's a really good, almost a metaphor for what's going on. I absolutely agree. It's interesting. I get asked a lot, what's your favorite healing? What's your favorite memory? And I always have to preface it by saying, well, I'm not sure, because in the mercy of God, there's been so much. But clearly one of the most profound ministry memories for me overseas was not a blind person seeing or a lame person walking, for which I'm very excited and thankful. But one of my deepest memories is being in this seaside village in a really poor part of the Philippines, and being on crawling up these like a ladder. It's like a tree fort, and going through the floor of this bamboo hut with a young mother and her 2 kids, whose husband had just been sent to prison for 6 years. She was so afraid for him, but also, of course, no social network in bamboo house villages. And I couldn't fix it. I couldn't say, oh, we'll take care of you for 6 years. I couldn't fix it. And all I could do ultimately was, she wept, was just put my arms around her and cry with her. That seems like too simple of a story for sometimes my listeners, but to me, though I was certainly not thinking of it in any theological sense at the time, but it's so interesting that is one of the deepest memories of all of the thousands of things that have gone on. Looking back, I feel like that was just Christ in the room with us, where all that I could do was put my arms around her and start to cry. Yeah. And we avoid that, by and large. The Christian culture, we avoid that, and
we want to fix it, and or if God doesn't fix it, we can end up resentful of God, and if we can't fix it, we end up abandoning the person because they didn't make a good testimony for us. I do have a testimony that it ends well, but it kind of echoes what you're describing. So I met this young student, I don't know, early 20s probably, but she had become a Christian when she was 14 years old, and on the day she became a Christian, she fell apart physically. She got fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue the day she became a Christian. She spent the next years bedridden and not being able to participate in life, and really lost all her teen years, and she'll never get them back. So I was at a discipleship training school, and she had dragged herself there, and she just like mainly stay in her room, but once in a while she'd come down to a class and participate as long as she could, and then she'd go back to bed. And it was just horrible. And so she's describing this for me, and I felt the grief, and like the very same thing. I can't fix you. I can't fix you. And then so I said, but what I could do is I could hold your hand and cry with you for a while. And I had her read Psalm 6 and Psalm 13 out loud. And they're both lament psalms that talk about, how long, O Lord? And I'm drenching my bed with tears. It feels like my body is burning up from the inside. All the kind of things that were so familiar to her, and just being allowed to lament them, right? And so she read the 2 psalms out loud, and we cried a bit, and then that was kind of it. And so I had the same experience as you. The remarkable thing is, the next day I did this same exercise with the group, where we would bring our burdens to Christ at the cross, and we'd ask him for his blessings and so on. And then I had to rush off to the airport. Well, probably, and then I added her to my prayer list of people just with fibromyalgia. I just hate that disease, and I feel so powerless against it, and I don't see it healed very often. So the ones that aren't healed, they're on that prayer list. And then, but about, it must have been 3 or 4 years later, she contacted me through Facebook and said, I don't know if I ever told you this. I think I forgot to tell you, but when I went to the cross and exchanged my burdens, I was completely healed.
Whoa.
I'm like, what? I've been wasting all these years pregnant. And she was sending me, she says, God gave me my life back. And here's a photo of me and my husband. I have a husband now. And then a few years later, she sent another one, and now there was a baby. And I'm like, this is so amazing. And so for her, the cross became a place of healing, but we didn't get to bypass the grief work of not being able to fix it, and the reality that she doesn't get to be 14 again. There's still real loss. So he had to bear that grief, that loss for her as well. But redemption is sweet, and all the more so when we see it in this life, I guess.
Yeah. When we see it in this life. So that leads me to something you said very close to the end of episode 11. You talked about this peace that was won on the cross. I'm just quoting you here. It is an ever-advancing and eternal peace. And as I listen to that, and then look around at the world we're in this very moment, of coronavirus sweeping across the entire globe, and suddenly people are literally retreating to their homes, as mandated by their federal governments. It begs a question: if Christ won this peace on the cross, this advancing and eternal peace, why do things seem to be getting worse and not better? If it is an ever-advancing peace, how does that fit with the reality we face in March of 2020?
And let me add to your question. If he defeated Satan and the powers at the cross, which he did, then why do we not see the elimination of his influence? Why do we see difficult times? So I'm going to just add to your question, and I'm going to ask Brad to answer it.
Yeah, and just to add one more, or to ask it in a different way, my eldest daughter is 11, and we were sitting around the table last week, and she asked a very similar question, which was a wonderful question, which was, well, if God can heal anybody, why doesn't he just heal everybody of coronavirus and wipe it out and it'll be over? And that's a pretty good question, too. What do you think, Brett?
What is the victory over the darkness at the cross? What does it mean for us here and now?
Yeah. Well, for here and now is the important part of that question, because I could easily just say, well, it's not about here and now. It's about like the resurrection, where he'll wipe every tear from our eyes. But there is a here and now to the kingdom, and there is an advance to the kingdom, and perhaps it's not getting worse. Perhaps it's getting better. That's a debate out there right now. But theologically speaking, we need to make lots of room for mystery here and not offer platitudes. But in a more Christ-like God, I try to talk about this in my chapter. Shit happens and God is good, and that is where we don't try to make a rational connection between the affliction of humanity and the goodness of God. If you try to offer a rational response to this, you will end up calling good evil or evil good every time. And but so God doesn't come with a rational explanation; He comes with a cross, and that's His response. Here's my response. I'm going to I consent to willing human defiance and the tragedies of natural law.
Yeah.
I don't interfere through force. Or imagine if he did. What would that have to look like? Think about it. He would have to handcuff me to a gurney so that I don't go out and harm people again today. He would actually have to medicate my mind so that I can't think impure or unkind thoughts. He would have to vegetabilize me, and I'm not even the worst of the bunch, probably. But
Well, you're pretty close.
I every time I have communion, I confess that I'm the chief of sinners. So there is that. But think about that. So if he can't use force, okay, how about natural law? Why can't he at least just interfere with natural law? Okay, so everyone who steps off a cliff, he's going to levitate them. Is that how it works now? Every car accident that happens because I wasn't paying attention, is he going to put like marshmallows between all the cars? Miraculous? Like it doesn't work that way. Let's just say, I'm saying it shouldn't work that way, but at least we know this for sure. It doesn't work that way. People who try to hang themselves are not levitated to prevent it, even in their mental illness and despair. People who intend harm for other people, he doesn't wrath them. That's why I don't believe in wrath as in violent anger to do harm. That's what wrath means. Violent anger to do harm. He just doesn't do that, and I wish he would. And when he didn't, I was mad at him. But then if he did it for others, he should probably do it for me. So we know it doesn't work that way. So how will he redeem this world? How is he, in fact, restoring all things? How is he fulfilling this statement? Behold, I am making all things new. How does he do it? Well, he did it, first of all, through the incarnation, where he doesn't just consent to all this bad stuff happening. He enters into it and he participates in it and he undergoes it and he overcomes it by surrender to his Father, such that the love of God could flow through him as the active ingredient that heals. And love is not the loving care of God mediated through a willing human partner in Christ is not interference, it's participation. And that love is actually the highest law that holds the universe together. So it's not a violation of natural law when love comes to bear on this stuff. Okay, but that's not just Christ. He's the first fruits of a new kind of kingdom where God reigns through love, which is to say, God reigns in this world by mediating his loving care through willing human partners like Impact Nations. And so so he's not preventing every disease that comes along, but he is he's calling out to people to become willing human partners in this. This is Bishop Desmond Tutu. He's like, for whatever reason, God does nothing in this world without the participation of a willing human partner, where Christ is the ultimate version of that, who's going to make sure ultimate redemption comes about. But in this life, what does that look like? Well, it looks like people risking themselves to bring good news that brings healing to people. And so I guess, that won't satisfy everyone, because I just gave you a rational explanation, and it's not that. It's about the love revealed through the cross and through us when we pick up the cross of co-suffering love.
Yeah. Brad, I want to ask a question that was emailed into us from a listener named Robert. And it's a good question. I think it fits in with this a little bit, just backing up a little bit in terms of what you were saying about your own thought life and what Christ's response to that could be and is. It's a bit of a long question, but I want to read the whole thing. And it's for both of you. It says, do each of you in your own lives see ways in which sinful patterns of thought or action or feeling still pop up every day? No matter how mature and how far along in sanctification you may be. I just ask this because I see many people with genuine hearts and desire to live for Jesus struggle greatly with old patterns and other junk that just goes against what they believe and are committed to. I think a harmful form of perfectionism which misinterprets different scriptures accentuates this. It can lead to a sensing deep inside that we somehow lack ability to love God. Jesus as God, or Jesus as we should. Perhaps we lack his love being able to just reside in us. So on this side of the cross, what does it mean to struggle with habitual sin and old patterns that continue to pop up?
I think I'll go first on this, Brad. And then...
Age before beauty, yes, please.
Oh, that one hurt. I really struggle with anger toward my buddy Brad when he takes shots at me, and and it's daily. Yeah, daily I have to take it to the cross. No, I think one of the things that is important is that Jesus didn't just take my sin at the cross; he took my brokenness. And the cross ministers not just in terms of righteousness, but also, as Robert says, these patterns. And I think that in one sense I can deny them, I can get frustrated with myself or whatever, or I can say, Lord, you draw me back to the cross again and again. So that's one thing. I also think, Brad, that my wife Christina does an Encountering God seminar that she's now taking to more and more countries, because she takes people through a deliberate process of breaking off old patterns and chains and so forth. And it's very powerful, but it doesn't mean, okay, now it's done. Now you don't have the kinds of things that Robert's talking about, but rather we get rid of a bunch of patterned ways of thinking and feeling. At least we begin to moderate those and change, and it enters into a process that ultimately, that's why she calls it Encountering God, leads us into a closer place. So for me, I used to spend so much time fighting with myself. No, take every thought captive. I see it really more as a reminder of the incredible grace of God. I think that's all I need to say right now. I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, I'm so totally with you on that. And I experience this in a few ways myself, where I kind of think about sin, whatever that is. Well, here's a couple ideas about sin. One is very, very simple. When I feel myself turning away from love. And repentance is when I turn back to love. And I think about it like a light, that Christ is the light of the world. He is the radiance of God's love for us. So when I'm turning away from love, 1 John is very pretty straightforward about it. If you love, you know God. If you don't love, you don't know God. And so, and I feel the peril to my soul, my withering soul, when I turn from love, and sometimes I'm powerless over that turn. But what another way of thinking about this then is, if it's kind of habitual and so on, then self-will got us in this problem in the first place. That's what's going on in the Garden of Eden, self-will. And that's what's going on with a lot of moralistic accountability partner BS, where it's like, I need to have self-control. Instead of it being a fruit of the Spirit, it becomes this willfulness kind of thing. And the miracle of, let's say, 12-step recovery is that they're like, self-will got you in this mess in the first place. That's not how you do it. You surrender to the care of a loving God, not to the control, but to the care of a loving God. So it's through surrender. And the other is when I'm very sad these days because my confessor of 7 years just passed away, and when I would go to him with my struggle, because struggle is a very good word for it, Tim. When I go to him with my struggle, he would never say, "Oh, what did you do this time? What are you guilty of? What sin do you have to confess?" What he would always say is, "What's troubling you?" And he recognized that I was experiencing anxiety from an accusing conscience because of my perpetual stumbles. And so I would tell him what's troubling me, and he would just say, "Of course, this is the human condition. We all go through this." So it's like, remember Romans 3:23. We used to hear it as I used to hear it as a young Baptist. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God.
Yeah.
Here's the tone. Oh, everyone sins. Duh. Of course. Of course. In fact, many times when you'd say, "What's troubling you?" I'd say, "Oh, I did this again." He'd go, "Well, of course, we all do this." But here's the important thing to know, that God has not left you, and you don't need to run and hide from him. He's not the one accusing you. It's your conscience. And so you don't need to be reconciled to God. Christ already did that. You need to be reconciled to your conscience. And here's how you do it. You hear the good news again. He's already forgiven you. Get up, come home, get up, and don't give it another thought. With the boldness that Christ has given us by saying to his apostles, "Whatever you loose is loose. I'm saying you are loosed. Go and, and so, and this burden would come off, right? But it was the burden of surrendering to loving care, or that is the light yoke. And the heavy yoke was the accusation and the self-will and the failed self-effort and all of the sort of those willful ways of trying to, I need to please God or I'm in big trouble. And I don't know if I shared this with you the other day, but it's like when I go to an airport and when I'm flying too much, I'll go to the chair massage. You can go get in the airport, and I'll just go, "Okay, I need some work on my back and shoulders because I'm like in trouble here." And I was in Dallas, Fort Worth, I think, at one of these things, and the masseuse says to me, "Stop fighting me." And I surrendered into the massage, and I feel like that's what God has for us. He just wants to do therapy on us, and sometimes it's not just like a relaxing massage. I think I left there with bruises on my shoulders. but this idea of, I'm certainly not, I've not reached full sanctification, and I don't actually expect to. Maybe I'm a man of little faith, but I feel like I'm in a perpetual struggle. And so, but I know what to do with it now. I surrender to the love of God.
Excellent. Wow, that was good.
That's good. Did you have anything else that you wanted to discuss with Brad? We're running close to our time.
Would you, for the sake of our viewers right now, would you mind touching upon, I'm going to make a statement which is coming from you, and then would you elaborate on that? You once asked a question: what if the highest revelation of God and his glory is the cross. Because, of course, we always think of Revelation 4 and 5 and 19, the throne and so forth, which is wonderful. But what if the highest revelation of the glory of God is at the cross? And that single question that either you asked me or I read from you, I don't know, it's probably half a dozen years ago, was one of the most influential questions in many, many years for me. Do you mind just opening that up a bit for our viewers?
Sure. I'll start by saying something that Simone Weil, one of my great saints, had said. Weil. It's really worth getting the book Awaiting God by Simone Weil, where she goes into all what we've talked about, the affliction of humanity and the goodness of God, but also this idea of the cross as the glory of God. She says, the resurrection matters a lot, but Hitler could have been resurrected 50 times and I still wouldn't worship him. I worship Jesus Christ because he won my heart at the cross. I'm like, oh my goodness. So how does the cross win our hearts to the love of God? It's because that is the revelation there. So if the glory of God, if his nature, his essential nature, is the glory of love, not the glory of being a superpower, but of love in its purest form. Where do we see it come into focus most clearly? It's on the cross. And so I often use the expression that the cross is the definitive revelation of God himself as self-giving, radically forgiving, co-suffering love. We don't see that anywhere so clearly in the whole universe. It comes to this blazing focus as the one on the cross gives everything of himself. This is that God held nothing back to the point of death and then even entering the grave, and that he withheld no. There's no withholding of forgiveness and mercy and grace there. It's like it's for everybody for all time to the very depths, radically forgiving and then co-suffering. It's like that every bomb that's ever been dropped, every weapon that's ever been fired, every assault that's ever taken place, that is the harm of humankind, he drew that up into himself. All the darkness, spiritual, emotional, and physical, he drew it up. He drew it. That's, I think, Vey talks that way. He drew it up into himself, and in there, he separates out the evil and conquers it, and purifies the suffering, and then recycles it as forgiveness and life. And so I don't see such a concentrated form of glory anywhere else, if glory is not about being Superman. Glory about infinite divine love. It's flowing from, remember the great hymn, see from his wounds, his hands, his feet, glory and what is it? Sorrow and love flow mingled down, and where has ever that met and composed such. We really should look at the words of that hymn again, because it's all there. Actually, we've been singing about it for decades and centuries and so on, but to envision it that way, and not as a past event, but as something planted in our hearts right now. The cross is a place in your heart, and you can approach Christ there.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
I'll pass it to Tim as he wraps this up, but I just wanted to say to our viewers, if you've not read Brad's book, which is now probably, about 4 years ago, A More Christlike God, I encourage you. It's like core reading, mandatory reading almost. I would encourage you to get that A More Christlike Way, which came out this past year. An interesting little book you wrote called In. And what was that built around? There were 3 words.
Incarnation and Inclusion, and then Abba and Lamb.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I would just encourage you guys to get those books and read them prayerfully and carefully. Brad, thank you for being such a dear friend to this ministry, and I'll pass it over to Tim.
I was about to scold Dad for banging on the table. You did pretty well today. We don't have to bring out the oven mitts. Well, you said what I was going to wrap up with, which is if you want to just dig deeper into these things, Brad's written some fantastic books. You can catch all of that at bradjerzak.com. There's links in the show notes here on Facebook or on the podcast. Normally, Brad, I would ask if you've got any events that you're plugging, but obviously there are no events anywhere on the planet right now. I don't know if you're doing any other online stuff that people can follow.
Well, hunker down and read good books, and so that you don't bleed it all away on social media. But if you want to find me there, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as well.
There you go.
And that's where I will have links to articles as I release them.
Yes, and you follow Brad on Twitter. I do, and he's got some fantastic articles that he links to that are just make you go.
And I think you're coming back to this spot, aren't you?
Indeed. So we're going to do this 3-part series. So next week on the audio podcast is going to be a teaching on some of the theology and theological arguments about the cross that have happened throughout history. And then so 2 weeks from now we will come back with Brad and have a discussion about that teaching, and then another 2 weeks after that we'll dig in further. So
all right, shall we schedule it right now live?
Let's do it. Yes. I like Wednesdays. Do you like Wednesdays?
Wednesdays have
all
got
right,
a great
two
feel.
Wednesdays from now. Normally, folks, I do an advertisement partway through the podcast. You know that. This week I'm not doing that. In light of all that's happening around the world right now, we're obviously really rethinking a lot of things that impact nations in terms of especially journeys of compassion. Obviously, nobody's scheduling a flight right now to anywhere in the world. But I would just encourage you to make use of these resources. Buy 1 or 2 of Brad's books. impactnations.com/shop. We've got some books there as well that Dad's written. A book that's really poignant for right now is The First Church Restored, which is really looking at the first century church and how it applies, how we can learn lessons from how Jesus made disciples, how the early church made disciples. And I honestly don't think it's been more poignant than right now in the world we're living in. So grab that. You can get it in an ebook or get it shipped to you. impactnations.com/shop is a good place to start. If you're not subscribing to this podcast, please do so. Even if you want to start way back at the beginning, our first season was a really big study on John. I think it was 33 episodes. We had several question and answer times with Brad as well. So, man, if you got time right now, go back, listen to the series on John, or catch up on the series on the mystery of Christ, which is season 3. impactnations.com/podcast. You can subscribe. There's a subscription button for your favorite podcast app there, or you can just listen right on the website as well. So lots of options for you, but I would encourage you, spend this time, get in the scriptures, just listen to what the Lord's saying, and go out, find a way to be a blessing to your community. And join us again in a couple weeks for some further discussion with Brad.
Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you. We'll see you then.
Yeah.